Welcome to the second lecture in the CSS Foundation section. So this lecture will be the Cascade. So the CSS, the C stands for Cascade. Let me take the markdown. Added it in my markdown editor. So let's go full screen. Introduction. In the previous lesson, we covered basic CSS syntax and selectors. Now it's time to combine our knowledge of selectors with the C of CSS, the Cascade. Lesson overview. What the Cascade does, specificity and combining CSS selectors, how inheritance affects certain properties. Very nice. So the Cascade of CSS. Sometimes we may have rules that conflict with one another and we end up with some unexpected results. But I wanted these paragraphs to be blue. Why are they red like these other paragraphs? As frustrating as this can be, it's important to understand that the CSS doesn't just do things against our wishes. CSS only does what we tell it to do. One exception to this is the default styles that are provided by a browser. These default styles vary from browser to browser, and they are why some elements create a large gap between themselves and other elements, or why buttons look the way they do, despite us not writing any CSS rules to style them that way. So if you end up with some unexpected behavior like this, it's either because of these default styles, not understanding how a property works, or not understanding this little thing called the cascade. The cascade is what determines which rules actually get applied to our HTML. There are different factors that the cascade uses to determine this. We will examine 3 of these factors, which will hopefully help you avoid those frustrating I hate CSS moments. So you don't want that to happen. You want to avoid those frustrating I hate CSS moments. Specificity. CSS declaration that is more specific will take precedence over less specific ones. Inline styles, which we went over in the previous lesson, has the highest specificity compared to selectors, while each type of selector has its own specificity level that contributes to how specific a declaration is. Other selectors contribute to specificity, but we are focusing only on the ones we have gone over so far. So till now we have done ID selectors, which has start with a hashtag, most specific selector. So this is top priority out of the 3. Then comes the class selectors having a dot, and then there are the type selectors. Specificity will only be taken into account when an element has multiple conflicting declarations targeting it, sort of like a tiebreaker. An ID selector will always beat any number of class selectors. A class selector will always beat any number of type selectors, and a type selector will always beat any number of anything that is less specific than it. So this order is clear. This one is most priority. This one is ID is the most priority. Type is the least priority. Any number of specific, less specific than it. When no declaration has a selector with a higher specificity, a larger amount of a single selector will beat a smaller amount of that same selector. So then it is the number of count. So 2 will be greater than 1, 3 will be greater than 2, like that. Let's take a look at a few quick examples to visualize how specificity works. Consider the following HTML and CSS code. So let's take this in. So we'll go to our editor and let's clear everything up. So everything inside the body will clear up. Okay, looks good. We'll paste this here. And in our styles, we will remove everything. So let's save both of them. We'll refresh. So we have a div main and they have a div inside a div. So there are no other content. So that's why we see nothing. So the rule here is subsection has a color blue and main list has a color red. So let's take those rule 1 and rule 2 and put it in our styles. Done. Does that change anything? No, because the divs have no content. So let's add some content. So this is the main and this one is the list, right? So this one is list. So let's put list inside. So now we should see some content. So this is main and this is the list. And another good way of seeing it is adding background. So I'm using background on both of them. So I use Control D to select multiple keywords, same keywords, and edit them at the same time. So you can see this background is blue, this background is red. So there is a subsection blue, but that doesn't apply. Instead, what applies is the main list. So dot main dot list. So let's see the explanation. In the example above, both rules are using only class selectors, but rule 2 is more specific because it has using more class selectors. So the color red declaration would take precedence. That's what we are seeing. We see that the red background red from the second rule is what is affecting instead of this first one. Clear? The specificity is clear here. Now let's change things a little bit. So div class instead of the main, the same HTML remains the same, and the subsection is color blue, whereas main list is color red. In the example, so this is hash. The ID has now changed. So even though this class inside is same, this subsection is now an ID. So let's change that. Let's make this as the ID. So close this one, have an ID. Yes. So that way the styles will not apply now because ID subsection. And here what we have to do is subsection has a color blue and main dot list has the color red. So let's replace this style, take everything, put everything back here. So if I refresh, so it's a blue. Now hash subsection. In the example above, despite rule 2 having more class selectors than ID selectors, rule 1 is more specific because ID beats class. In this case, the color blue declaration would take precedence. That's why we will see now our list has turned blue because ID has taken precedence and it's colored blue. Now this, in the final example, so we are using the same HTML. Let's update the CSS. So in the updating the CSS, select everything, pasting this thing in. Now if we refresh, so background color subsection hash subsection gets the background color from this rule, whereas the color comes from main subsection. So color comes from this. So it's red. It's not color blue, but it's red. So it gets dot main subsection. Let's look at the example explanation. In this final example, the first rule uses an ID selector, while the second rule combines an ID selector with a class selector. So now there is a combination. Therefore, neither rule is using a more specific selector than the other. The Cascade then checks the number of each selector type. Both rules have only one ID selector, but rule 2 has a class selector in addition to the ID selector. So rule 2 has higher specificity. So this one has higher specificity. This property will take precedence of any other property over any other property for the same element. While the color red declaration would take precedence, the background color yellow would still be applied since there are no conflicting declaration for it. So let's conflict that one as well. So this was background color yellow. Let's conflict that. Let's have a background color. Let's call it green. And what do you guess? So obviously you guessed right. This background color will take the precedence and it will turn green. So yellow will not apply now. Amazing. While the color red declaration would take precedence, background color declaration will still be applied, no conflicting. Not everything, so this is important. Not everything adds to the 1, 2, 3, 4. Not everything. So there is a typo over here. Let's have 5 of these. Not everything adds to the specificity. Let's remove this. Somehow it is not getting applied. There is some white space here. Not everything adds to specificity. When comparing selectors, you may come across special symbols for the universal selector, as universal selector is the asterisk, as well as combinators. So there is a plus, there is a tilde, there is a greater than sign, and an empty space. These symbols do not add any specificity in and of themselves. So here is an example, dot class second class, and there is a space. In the second rule, there is a space. Here both rule 1 and 2 have the same specificity. Rule 1 uses a chaining selector, no space, and rule 2 uses a descendant combinator, the empty space. So no space, this is chaining, and this is space, so this is descendant. And rule 2 uses a descendant combinator, the empty space. But both rules have two classes, and the combinator symbol itself does not add to the specificity. So out of this, whatever is declared at the bottom, so that will take precedence. Another example, class second dot second class and greater than dot second class. This example shows the same thing. Even though rule 2 is using a child combinator, that is a greater than sign, this does not change the specificity value. Both rules still have two classes, so they have the same specificity values. Another example on star, color black, and h1, color orange. In this example, rule 2 would have a higher specificity and the orange value would take precedence for this element. Rule 2 uses a type selector which has the lowest specificity value, but rule 1 uses the universal selector which has no specificity value. So rule 2 wins over in this case. Inheritance. Inheritance refers to certain CSS properties that, when applied to an element, are inherited by that element's descendants. Even if we don't explicitly write a rule for those descendants, typography-based properties like color, font size, font family, anything related to the font typography are usually inherited, while most other properties are not. The exception to this is when the directly targeting an element, as this always bit inheritance. So if you directly target an element, example here parent and child, let's copy this over to our editor. I will put it in my HTML and indent them properly. And let's take the style. So the parent color red. I will have to add some content for the divs to show up. So right now it shows nothing, but we can add some content. So inside parent, let me write parent, and inside child, let me write child. Now parent and child will show up. So why is it red color? Parent has the color red and child has the color blue. Despite the parent element have a higher specificity with the ID, the child element would have the color blue style applied, since that declaration directly targets it, while color red from the parent is only inherited. So if I didn't have this child element, so if I comment this out, then the parent will get apply on the child element as well. So now whatever was on the parent will also get applied on the child will become red as well. But if it is now specifically targeting the child class, it will turn blue. Rule order. The final factor, the end of the line, the tiebreaker of the tiebreaker. Let's say that after every other factor has been taken into account, there are still multiple conflicting rules targeting an element. How does the cascade determine which rule to apply? It's really simple actually. Whichever rule is the last defined is the winner. So alert has color red, warning has color yellow. For an element that has both the alert and warning classes, the cascade would run through every other factor, including inheritance, none here, and specificity. Neither rule is more specific than the others. While the warning rule has the last one defined and no other factor was able to determine which rule to apply, is the one that gets applied to the element. So because this comes later, both have the same class, the element will get this property. This property will apply as a final one. Assignment, go back to our CSS repository. So we have our Odin project repository and finish the last exercise, which is 06 cascade fixing. Remember the recipe page you created as practice from the HTML Foundation section? Well, it's rather plain looking, isn't it? Let's fix that by adding some CSS to it. So now you have learned about font, color, background, and texts, everything about typography. So you can try that exercise. How you actually style is completely open, but you should use the external CSS method for this practice and moving forward. You should also try to use several of the properties mentioned in the previous lesson. So color, background color, typography properties, etc. So make sure that you are using at least each of the properties in one element. At least one element should have each of the properties. Take some time to play around with the various properties to get a feel for what they do. For now, don't worry at all about making it look good. This is just to practice and get used to writing CSS, not to make something to show off on your resume. So this is practice, plain practice. Have some good fun with it. We haven't covered how to use a custom font for the font family property yet, you might be wondering. So for now, take a look at CSS fonts. So CSS fonts is on W3 Schools for a list of generic font families to use. And CSS web safe fonts, this also comes from W3 Schools, yeah. W3 Schools link for a list of fonts that are web safe. So web safe means that these are fonts. So what is web safe? Let's highlight that part. What do I mean by web safe? Web safe means these are fonts that are installed on basically every computer device but be sure to still include a generic font family as a fallback. So I will highlight this thing so that I remember. This is bold, so I will come back to it later. I can go through this as a summary. Knowledge check between a rule that uses one class selector and a rule that uses 3 type selectors. Which rule has the higher specificity? So you can go check this out. Additional resources, what we have in additional resources, CSS Cascade is a great interactive read. So this is on wattenberger.com. This is a blog. It's a great interactive read that goes a little more in detail about the other factors that affect the CSS rules actually end up being applied. Changing the font family. This is also an external article, describes a few different approaches to using custom fonts. CSS specificity explained from Kevin Powell. This is, I think, on YouTube, yeah. When from Kevin Powell goes through various specificity examples and gives some advice on avoiding wrestling with specificity. CSS specificity calculator allows you to fill in your own selectors and have the specificity calculated and visualized. So this is on specificity. There is a specific on keygun.ht. You have a specific link for that. And Mozilla CSS, so this is on MDN. Mozilla CSS properties reference can be used to learn if a particular CSS property is inherited or not. Simply look for the inherited field inside the formal definition section. Here's an example of the CSS color property. So this is on Mozilla. Here's an example for the CSS color property. Interactive screen, you can go on screen bar and look for CSS Cascade. So with that, we come to the end of cascading, and this will be the end of this lecture. So next we'll be looking at inspecting HTML and CSS.